Let me go ahead and preface this story by saying that, for a little bit of time before this particular incident, there had already been some very weird things going on in my house. Nothing crazy, mind you. It was mainly just little things like different members of my family thinking they heard footsteps, maybe a shadow move out of the corner of their eye. You know, what people take as the stereotypical type of ghost activity. I wouldn't consider my family to be any firm believers in that kind of stuff, but it had gotten to the point where it had happened to enough of us that it mainly turned into a running joke with the family. We'd mess with each other saying things like, "Hey, seen any ghosts today?" Since none of us really took it seriously. People always hear things and it could be explained any number of ways. Now, we have a room in our house that we recently decided to renovate into a craft room for our mom since she liked to scrapbook and could use the space since the room really wasn't being used for anything else. My brother and I were in charge of doing a lot of the renovation and heavy lifting, moving in the large bookshelves, finding the wall studs and drilling in the wall shelves, the usual stuff for that kind of project. We eventually got the room finished up and it was looking pretty good. A few nights later, a couple of our family friends came over for a game night, but I remember calling it a little early that night from being a bit tired from that day. So my room sits at the end of a hallway that connects to our game room, and in between sat the new renovated crafts room. At this point, only one of our friends remained in the game room, hanging out watching TV. I felt myself starting to doze off, when suddenly I was jolted fully awake by the loud sounds of some kind of crash and stuff breaking from down the hall. I leaned up, assuming our friend had broken something, but as I leaned up to look over at him, I saw he was already staring at me. And almost out of instinct, we both turned at the same time to look at the side room. We got up together and slowly walked over to peer into the room. The whole thing was practically destroyed. One of the large bookshelves was completely knocked over. One of the wall shelves was ripped out and hanging by the right side screw, and drawers and paper were flung all across the place. We had no pets in there, and no gust of wind could have caused what we saw, or let alone knock over the heavy bookshelves. And those bookshelves were absolutely level and solidly in place. We made sure of it. Even the screws we used for the wall shelves were long, thick construction screws that would have had to have been ripped straight out with quite a bit of force to end up like they were. We both pretty much panicked and ran downstairs to meet everyone else to explain what just happened. We all slept downstairs that night. Oddly enough, there were no more small occurrences after that night. It all just seemed to stop after that. My family and I didn't even know what to think. We fixed the room and continued on with our lives. But from that point on, we all thought a bit differently about anything possibly paranormal. I was back in college during the time of this story. It was my fourth year or so of living away from home, and a couple of buddies of mine and I had moved out of the dorms and joined up to live in our own place close to campus. More expenses involved, of course, but having our own home to live in for the first time was pretty exciting. It was a nice spot of town, bus route nearby, friendly community managers. It was one of the best times of my life I can remember. Now, of course, when you live with someone for a while, you start to pick up each other's schedules and daily life patterns as people come and go from the house. And definitely by this particular point, we all knew each other's schedules pretty well. Nothing weird ever really happened in the house up to this point, but one night it was just me in the house while everyone else was out and about doing their thing, and I knew I would be alone until my roommate, who we'll just call Ben, got home from his evening class. His room was practically right next to mine, and the walls of this place weren't super thick, but thankfully Ben was a relatively quiet guy. I was sitting at my desk, typing out a paper for one of my classes, when all of a sudden I heard the drawers in Ben's room opening and closing, followed by the sound of his closet door doing the same. That's weird. I didn't hear our front door open, and he shouldn't even be back yet regardless. "Ben? Did you get out early?" There was no response, only the soft sounds of what seemed like movement going up our stairs followed by movement above me. Did someone break in somehow without me hearing? I grabbed one of my weapons I kept for home defense and began sweeping the house. First downstairs, then upstairs. It wasn't the largest house, so it didn't take long to clear, but there were no signs of anyone else. All doors and windows were closed and locked, and nothing seemed to be missing. I told the guys that night once they were all back home, and thankfully they all seemed to believe me, even if it did seem to be with a modicum of skepticism. I didn't sleep very well that night. I was so sure of what I heard, given I had heard that same thing several times before while Ben was in his room. The sounds were incredibly familiar, I wouldn't have mistaken them. Nothing weird like that ever happened again in the house. But that one night absolutely left an impression I don't think I'll be soon to forget. A few years back now, I worked alongside a website that people used if they were looking for advice on dealing with any paranormal phenomenon they might be experiencing. It wasn't the fanciest website or the fanciest job for that matter, but it was widely used by people in the area, and I was one of the workers contacted the most. I don't do work there anymore though because of this particular story. The job mainly consisted of talking to people about their experiences over the phone, and I was pretty well studied in the area. But if people wanted, we even offered meetups where we'd meet someone at their home or business to discuss what they were dealing with and look over their place to see if anything could be explained away by natural means. A lot of times it ended up that way, but we were happy to help. Nothing ever got too crazy, but I remember one call I received very clearly, different from the rest. The lady on the other end of the line sounded very frightened right off the bat. I tried my best to calm her down and asked her to explain what was going on so that I could help her. She began telling me about little things that started to happen in her house a few weeks back, but had escalated to her being pushed down the stairs at one point and feeling like she was being scratched in her sleep. She was starting to feel threatened that this thing was wanting to hurt her. If she was telling the truth, it definitely seemed like this thing could be malicious, and I told her she should reach out to someone to bless the house and that we had connections for that. Still frightened though, she asked if I could come out and look over the place first to see if maybe she was just crazy. I reluctantly said yes, not really knowing if I wanted to get involved with a potentially aggressive entity. We met up at her place and I immediately saw the bruises as she greeted me and the fear in her eyes. It's never a good sign. I began sweeping the house, and while everything seemed physically intact around the place, something consistently felt wrong while I was there. No occurrences happened while I was there, so I gave her all the advice I could and again insisted that if it kept up to use our connection to priests in the area. That uneasy feeling never left me though, even as I got back home, like a fog lingering around me thick. That night while I was lying in bed, I started hearing what sounded like soft crying coming from one of the corners in my room. I sat up and saw what looked like a shadow hunched over in the corner continuing to cry. As I started to get out of bed, the crying suddenly stopped, and the head of this thing began to slowly turn towards me only to disappear entirely. I ended up taking some sleep aid after that to help knock me out given I was pretty rattled afterwards, and it thankfully kicked in very quickly. I was abruptly awoken later that same night though from a sharp pain coming from my back. I ran to my bathroom mirror and noticed 3 scratch marks going down my right side, decently deep enough that a little bit of blood was starting to come out. I immediately left my house and slept in my car for the rest of that night. Even then I hardly slept. I clearly overstepped myself, and the next day I removed my contact from the website and never did anything like it ever again. I never heard from that lady after that, and I'm almost glad for it. Whatever she was dealing with seemed to come after me too, and even though no more things happened to me following that night, what did happen was still plenty enough warning for me to stay away from the paranormal after that.